Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today we are diving into the subjects of reconnaissance and why it's trendy, as well as how it impacts our decisions when we look at both gear and community and culture. Today I am joined by somebody who I'm not supposed to be friends with because we came from different branches. But Blake, would you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Blake Flannery. I'm retired United States Marine. I served out of my 20 years, 17 of those in Force Reconnaissance. And now I can be found through social media, Blake Water 0326. And then I have another smaller page for my business, Maneuver Training Solutions, LLC, which is named my business, and you can find it online. And I offer small local courses where I live in the Camp Lejeune area. And then I also work through Orion Training Group, which probably more people are familiar with through my company. So that's what I'm up to these days.
Alrighty. Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to you through Orion Training Group. So let's hope for a good future.
Yeah.
I guess if that means anything. So this is, if you're this far into the show, you know that we are currently supported by you, our listeners. Thank you very much for joining us at the Redacted Culture Cast. You can find us on social media at Redacted LLC on Instagram. We're also streaming, or not streaming yet, but we're live on Instagram, Rumble, Spotify, or no, not Instagram, YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Apple podcasting platforms. You know how social media works. Like, share, subscribe, so we carry on, and we will we'll see you soon. If you want to, what is that? We'll see you soon. It's too early, and my coffee is just kind of weak today, so we'll carry on.
All right, Blake. My second pot.
Your second pot?
Yeah. In my defense, the first pot was made by my wife, and she made it kind of soft because that's how she likes it. I've got a built-in grinder, and I like that grinder to be choking because there's so many beans in it as it grinds. So I had to make a second pot.
Yeah, well, I was on the last amount of coffee left, so I just had to make like a 3/4 strength.
Yeah.
I use a French press, but who cares? So, yeah, it is. So we started on the subject of reconnaissance, and one of the ways that how this came up was because I think when I first saw any of your content on social media, you're sitting there with a chest rig on with like 16 or 17 magazines on, and I'm coming from a very different time or coming from a very different experience pool. Mm-hmm. Where we usually went out the wire with six or seven magazines, like one in the gun, 6 on the body, and saying that was enough is probably not the right thing. So my first question was like, is this a troll? Because I remember 10 years ago where we would go on a deployment and we would see what you would refer to as a pogue walking around base with just like mags upon mags upon mags, and then you found out that he was like a cook or something, or an admin guy, and I got to see the transition to, like, as kits started modifying within our community to slimmer and slimmer and slimmer builds. The magazine count kind of followed that a little bit, also because we were doing really, really fast hits and then some other stuff. So when I see 17 magazines, I'm thinking, oh goodness, is this one of those? And then, of course, I have to hear you talk, and then I'm like, oh, okay, now, we make evaluations of each other. We don't really know why we do it, but we do it anyway. It's the same thing with Ranger bat guys. You're like, oh, you're a Ranger? Oh, yeah. What bat were you in? What company?
Yeah, who'd you know?
Yeah, who'd you know? Yeah. And so they're like, someone with that hair couldn't be a Ranger. And I'm like, I know. I went as a Navy SEAL for Halloween, so we're good. But so the concept of reconnaissance, now you're coming from a Force Recon unit, and I don't know what that is. I mean, I do, but I don't. And it's an interesting subject because I don't understand the Marine Corps as well. What doctrinally is reconnaissance, and then what is the point of it?
The point of reconnaissance, and I no longer remember the exact definition that I had to write down 50 times a night, because that was 20 years ago. But the gist is that reconnaissance is to go out and gather information on something specific we separate them into 3 general categories of route, area, and zone. So you go find information about that route. So, hey, can I drive trucks up and down this road? An area would be, are there bad guys at this location? And if so, what is their size and activity? And then a zone recon would be like, we don't know anything about Cleveland, Ohio. Go check out some spots in Cleveland, Ohio, and tell me what the key terrain is and what the routes are in and out of Ohio. Like that's a zone. That's a whole big area. But that's the thing is you go, you gather some information, and then you bring that back. You disseminate that to the customer, the supported unit. That's reconnaissance. It's just go forth, gather information, disseminate that to the rear, and it could be as simple as that. A big thing for us, and so we always refer to our missions as reconnaissance and surveillance, or R&S, because you would be conducting that reconnaissance, as you're moving out, you kind of gathering information on spots as you walk by, like, can I land a helo here? Can I, do this or do that? But then you would normally end up establishing a static position and conducting continuous observation, which is now getting into surveillance. Now I'm trying to establish patterns of life and get a real feel for an area through consistent surveillance, consistent observation. And so that's where you really start getting into not a whole other animal, but just something that requires generally a more disciplined, more specialized individual within, the military.
Okay, because I ended up spending a very, very short amount of time with the Ranger, not with RRC, with people who know that, but in the Recon platoon, in Ranger Bat, and I'm saying very briefly, as in I don't think I was there much longer than 2 months because I ended up moving over to take a team, and it was also if I remember right, it was kind of in a time of transition, so it was like, for better or for worse, that's kind of how the cards played out. So I remember Recon being very frequently misrepresented according to this definition that you've given as basically human. I'm trying to go get human intelligence. I'm trying to go get eyes on a target or eyes on a thing. I'm looking through binos. I've got a camera or whatever it is, and I'm trying to figure out if that's the guy, and if that's the guy, where he's going, and then try to figure out that information in any way other than direct, like interrogation conversation.
Yeah.
So when you're zooming out and you're saying recon in the sense of like you've got a route, an area, or a zone reconnaissance, a route makes sense to me as like a positive action. I'm trying to establish a route to get somewhere. I have an objective, and I'm making a path to get there, or I'm finding a path to get there. Area, generally, I think of that as like, we're going to do a raid here. What's the environment? And then zone seems to be a little bit more passive, like, go find out something about Ohio. Well, I can do that on Instagram right now. It's a hellhole, I guess. But the point being is, those seem very different than like, what is this guy? Who is this our guy? Where does he live? What is his pattern of life? Now you consider that surveillance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. That now gets into surveillance. So even like, you can be tasked with conducting a zone recon, and the zone recon would come into play because we have no information. The commander has no information about that established zone, right? And it could be very, arbitrary boundaries. It can be, eastings and northings on a map, and just making a box and like, hey, that's your zone. Or it can be defined with terrain, like from, this mountain range to this mountain range. Like, I need to know everything in this valley, from this northing to this northing, or some other terrain feature. And you would collect a lot of information. So you would do multiple route recons, like, what are the avenues of approach in and through this zone? What is their trafficability? What are frequented by locals? What are used by the adversary? You would do your area recons, and the area recons wouldn't just be like your pre-target reconnaissance and surveillance. It would be what is the key terrain? Like, where are these like hilltops and bridges and things where, if they're controlled, give me tactical advantage in the area, right? So you're going out doing those area recon. So a zone is really like a lot of route and area recon all mixed together, and you're bouncing around and you're doing all this. And you might stop in certain places and conduct surveillance, throughout a period of daylight, because it's usually less advantageous to be moving. So if you can stop and set up an observation post and conduct surveillance, on, say, a bridge, you're doing an area reconnaissance over that bridge, and how is it trafficked and who is it trafficked by, and yada, yada, yada. So those are missions that take a lot of time, but they help build a better picture for that commander. And at the same time that you're there on the ground, there can be other assets in play. They're setting up, drones. They can be doing overflights with manned aircraft, and there's other forms of gathering information like signals. You talk about human. You can send human people in. Once like the ground recon team's got eyes on an area, they send a report back, and that might become interesting. So okay, send in some human guys now. So there's a lot of other things that can go into it, but as far as like the reconnaissance piece, the ground recon piece, that's kind of it.
Okay, so there's for the last 10 years at least, there's been a lot of attention on, say, direct action or semi-direct action special operations units, like Ranger Battalion, to a lesser extent, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, this kind of like MARSOC, even in that extent, where like you have this idea of like, okay, the target package has been established. We've built a mock-up building. We've done dry runs on the building. We're going to go hit this target now.
Yeah.
HVTs, HVIs. Where where I understand in like a chain of decision making is actually pretty late in the pattern, right? It's it's build a target, surveil a target, hit a target, right? Whereas like where does maybe force recon on one side, and then where does recon fit in the ecosystem or not the ecosystem, where does it fit within the hierarchy and the relationship to like the commander and the mission set? Where's its place? Because I think there's a lot of assumptions that can be quickly made on that one.
Yeah, so normally your reconnaissance elements are going to be held at a higher level within the unit. You are working for that actual unit commander, like that large unit commander. So in the Marine Corps, like we don't do brigade combat teams, we do regimental combat teams. But as far as I know, or understand the Army, it's like basically the same size unit. I
don't know the big Army. I have no idea how they work.
I'm not sure, but like so we have like regimental combat teams, and then you would have another level above that, like say in Iraq or Afghanistan, that might oversee like two different RCT areas of operation. So like the Force Recon Platoon would work for that commander, and then you would get pushed out into either one of those AOs based on the needs of those commanders. It'd be like, hey, we need to know more information about this area. The request goes up, but then there can also be reconnaissance, whether it be force or battalion, and that all gets super cloudy. But reconnaissance Marines in general can also be at that regimental level as well. And then we have, the Marine Expeditionary Units, which is another form of air ground task force. And they will have a reconnaissance element. So if a MU is pulled into country, that colonel has reconnaissance platoons at his disposal that he can either then task or he can farm out to another commander, whether it be an RCT, whether it be a task force, and then they go and conduct that reconnaissance as needed. And much like SOF, well, we can't call it direct action anymore because recon does not fall under SOCOM. So we can't call it direct action. We have to call it limited scale raids. It's the same mission we always did before the standing up of MARSOC. So we train to it as well. And so you can literally have, like, within a company of 2 platoons of recon, you can have one platoon has a couple teams out and they're doing reconnaissance surveillance of an area. building that target package, and then another platoon is gearing up to then go conduct the raid. Or they're all just there. There's been a lot of where they just get called, attached to a task force, and they're basically just on standby to provide QRF or outer cordon for, name your flavor of soft task force.
Okay, outer cordon meaning like not directly in your chain of command or your task force at the time.
Yeah, so outer cordon would be like blocking positions.
Oh, outer cordon.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you said I thought you said something else, like out of basically out of normal column. No, it's a language okay, so you call it out of cordon when you work with it. We just called it a joint JTO, but makes sense.
Yeah.
So you and I have been having a bit of a conversation about some of the interworkings of the military. I think that helps me in the sense of familiarization with how you guys think about some stuff. It's been some while. I want to kind of turn your experience and knowledge, your background in Recon to a fictional and real scenario, so that it kind of turns into one real. We'll do a real one first, and then we'll do a fictional one on what it actually looks like and how you would think about something in this scenario. And for example, I recently moved away from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so for the last 2 years, since 2020, there's been a lot going on there. Whether it's the riots after George Floyd or George Floyd's death, or kind of things moving on from there, as far as that opened up kind of a power structure and different, let's just say underground not political, but you've got issues with kind of cartel-y kind of things and different crime networks and all these. It was a big shakeup for sure. There was a void, different parties, not right and left, but different party or groups kind of started vying for influence in certain areas, and crime continued to scale. Now, let's just say in the realness of that would be, what is the objective that a recon? Well, how would you recon an area like Minneapolis, where you've got a very dense urban population surrounded by suburbs, surrounded by up to about 50 miles out? It gets really rural, where it's just woods and houses.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at, let's just say the reason why a force might be in that region is because you have an insurgency that is using a politically motivated or a political movement as sort of cover to disrupt and terrorize a population. And so you've got an environment where you've got some rural, semi-urban, and urban settings with a population that is mixed, that is generally aligned politically from a zoomed out scale. But when you get in, you start realizing that there's nuances between, let's just say, your average voting citizen and your person who's willing to engage with domestic terrorism. And then you've got that person who's in the middle, who's sort of easily swayed. And you would have to, you're part of a unit that has to go in, and you're not necessarily, you're unsure whether you're looking at you're not sure at the, let's say, the concentration of conflict. You just know that that's where it's coming from, and that there's an organization cell in there that may be involved in the government. How would you conduct reconnaissance for a contemporary task force on a rural, semi-urban, and urban environment in that scenario?
Yeah, so that starts sounding like essentially a zone recon task.
Okay.
Hey, here's the zone. You've got the city of Minneapolis, and you've got the outlying suburban areas, and then the exurban areas, and that goes into rural. We need to know X information about that leading up to this point. And so that conflict point you're talking about would definitely be an area recon, which would definitely turn into a surveillance mission and establishing patterns of life and trying to see who comes and goes. And that's how we would start building, target packages from there by seeing who's coming and going. So with that being an important piece and kind of knowing where that's at, and because, it's a U.S. city, so we have a fair amount of, pre-hand knowledge about it. that would take a team, maybe two, to then go into that area and trying to kind of blend in. And now your camouflage wouldn't be, M81 or MARPAT or, OCP. It would be what actually helps you blend in with the background, which is the local populace.
I was gonna say ACUs. Nothing blends in better than ACUs.
Yeah.
Like the couches will never see me coming.
Yeah, grandma's couch.
Jeez.
Yeah, so that would be, we kind of refer to that as like low vis, which is funny because, all of your reconnaissance should be low visibility, but it's hiding in plain sight. You have a lot of vehicle hides. You would be trying to develop, ways to establish hide sites in buildings, which is tricky in an urban environment because they're typically inhabited. But yeah, so it'd be a lot of as much surveillance as you can manage, and then definitely a lot of reconnaissance of just like a drive-by with a camera concealed in a very convenient location in a car, and so you get 30 seconds of video as you drive by, and then maybe another group in another vehicle would do the same thing from a different angle, a different direction, an hour later or something like that. Getting what you could, and then meanwhile, if the commander needed more information about what's happening in those rural and ex-urban areas, that's where you might start seeing guys in what we all kind of more think of, more traditional of in camouflage utilities, normal deuce gear, rucking up and conducting an infiltration through the wood line to establish, because maybe during the reconnaissance of that conflict point, we establish that they have a line of communication to a safe house, out or somewhere outside the city where they feel it's safer from authorities because it's, remote. So a team might go conduct reconnaissance on that. And then if it's determined that it is, in fact, a safe house, that would turn into then a need for surveillance to establish a pattern of life there as well.
Okay, so there's a scaling or like a zeroing in. You start like the area, you've got the whole zone of Minneapolis proper, and then you move into, you're like, okay, we're going to focus on this area, which is probably, it might get fortunate enough to do area, but you would define an area in, let's say, a urban scenario by like streets and blocks, or would that kind of?
It could be as defined as a single building.
Okay, and then you would zero, and then you could even get a little bit tighter and be like, okay, we're looking at specifically this individual. So there's a lot of physicality to it. Yeah, it would still be
like an area recon / area surveillance, but then you are, and Benny, where you are looking for certain people. So you might sit there and you might watch people coming in and out of, let's say an apartment building all day long, and you generally don't take much note of most of the people coming in and out until you see someone who meets that description, or like hey, that is the person. Like, I've got the picture, that's the person, and so you really hone in on their specific activities that you can observe and report on.
Okay, and all of this is presupposed by you have an objective. Like the reconnaissance, the one thing I'd be concerned is that people about reconnaissance is that it might be misconstrued as the element that's used to set the goals or discover the objectives, as opposed to you already have an objective and now you're setting somebody to go pave the way.
Yes,
intellectually.
We classified it, or was termed at least, was a named area of interest. Mm-hmm. So, there's at this point, it's a named area of interest. And, even though like when I prep a patrol in a team and I would give an order, and in that order, there is the mission paragraph, which is your mission statement. The reality is that reconnaissance doesn't conduct missions. We conduct tasks. We are tasked with conducting reconnaissance. We are tasked with surveillance. And so we fulfill that task. The actual mission would be, eventually with something like this would be a raid to capture or kill this individual, or, destroy a node, whatever it would be. There'd be an actual objective behind all of this reconnaissance and surveillance. Our task is to answer information requirements of the commander. So that can be, everything from, as simple as identifying, maybe we don't know exactly who these HVIs are, and through constant persistent surveillance, we start to hone in on who's who in the zoo. Establishing breach points for a raid force, establishing their routes to get to the target site, establishing all kinds of things that the people who are truly going to meet the objective are going to need. Our goal is to provide information. And that's another hard part that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of young guys, they're like, oh yeah, I provide intelligence. It's like, no, you collect and report information. That then goes to other people who aggregate that information, because you're not the only one. There could be other teams out there. We talk about there could be drones, there could be manned flights. There's the human folks, signals, everything that's out there. All that stuff is going back to a central node where it's aggregated and turned into actionable intelligence. We simply collect information. We are part of the intelligence process, but I don't provide intelligence. I merely provided information.
Okay, cool. So that helps out a lot, I think, in helping kind of retain the objective, because we'll get into this later, but I think when it comes to ideas like CQB and reconnaissance and the military to civilian kind of question is, and I phrased this in the same way a number of times, the military and civilian question is unfortunately the fact that even though for the military, the missions are usually pretty determined, unless you're going through the officer corps, then you're trying to figure them out. There are exceptions to the rule. But what civilians don't have is they don't have a mission set. They don't really have a target package, which is, we've kind of brought this up before. Usually when civilians or citizens in the wild start building target packages, they kind of look suspicious. Yeah. For good reason. I'm not saying that this isn't to an evaluative condemnation about the individual's actions, but there's a reason why but when an individual starts building a target package who doesn't otherwise have reason to, or let's just say sanction to,
yeah,
it can be questionable, because it's like the kid at school who's got a little black book and it says kill list and it's got all the people who pick on him.
Well, it's like the guys who got arrested for plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan.
Oh, that was an FBI plot. None of that was real.
Yeah. But
I'm not.
They had a target package, right?
The target package. Yeah. You know who the target package was provided by? The FBI.
Yeah.
So it was,
but just using it that idea, because they needed that, right? Because just a bunch of dudes who talk about it, right? You can sit there and you can talk about all you want. That's the beauty of our First Amendment.
Absolutely.
And you can sit there and you can look through binoculars at somebody, but when you start collecting that information, now you start taking photos and you're collecting those photos and you're putting that stuff together and creating what could be construed as a target package, that's where you get yourself in trouble with Johnny Law.
You could. I think that we have rights that are protected in the sense that if I spend time doing it, it's creepy and there might be a moral issue, but legally, I don't know. I don't see there being a direct legal prohibition as long as it's not preying on minors and already breaking some sort of law. But the idea that I could so I know somebody's pattern of life, that could be really easy mistaken as I know my boss's schedule and I'm his secretary.
Yeah.
Right. And so, the issue with the Whitmer plot is a really good example too, because they had a target package and they seemed to have a plan and they were going to go kidnap this person and do these terrible things. And you're yeah, all of this is terrible. But the issue is that all of the necessary elements, all the elements that were needed for, let's just say, legal prosecution were provided by the government. And that's why it became an issue. So, I mean, we can move on to maybe a less political subject, but that's a really interesting point, because it's like you look at what the government provided to this group of people, and it's exactly what they prosecuted them for.
Yeah.
And right now, I think some of them have actually been, of the people who were involved in that, some of them have actually been acquitted, because the jury said that we can't punish somebody for doing what they were told to do by an agent or whatever. So it's like, it's just a mess. But here's another one, and here's something. Let's go to something fictional and equally controversial.
Okay.
The latest Call of Duty game dropped recently, and there's a bit of a plot element that involves the U.S. border, where you have this idea. There's a bit of a plot element regarding the U.S. border with Mexico, which is funny because when I say U.S. border, nobody thinks about Canada. But there's a plot element involving the U.S. border and the cartel being sort of co-opted with an international terror organization to smuggle people into the United States. So it's not like it's not like drugs and coyotes per se. It's like, let's say not human trafficking, but like WMDs kind of thought, right?
Oh, okay.
So like so let's just say the United States, we acquire a situation where we know that like there's issues with porous areas of the border, and we've come to confirm through biometrics and let's just say like a small human line that legitimate terrorism is being smuggled into America, like non-politically, just straight up like these people are bringing in suicide bombers and the orcs from Mordor or whatever, and they're coming up. We know that they're entering the United States through the porous elements of the United States border, and you've narrowed it down to two regions, one in New Mexico and one in Texas or whatever. So you've got a region that you're unfamiliar with, your unit is unfamiliar with, but you're tasked with reconnaissance on a very mostly rural, with the exception of border town spots, where you know that there's going to be already criminal activity because of drug movement, but also that area has been, let's just say, lost to the border patrol or whatever it is who's responsible for that area is at best in equal contention. They're not over.
Yeah, so you're in like non-permissive environment.
A very non-permissive environment with a rural setting with mountains and deserts and woods and lakes and rivers, where you already have criminal environments going on, but you also have something very, very much so larger, and you are certainly, as the reconnaissance unit, going to be the smaller of the two if you come into conflict with somebody. So you're wondering if like the cartel is setting up checkpoints so that they can get, smuggle their whoever they've contracted to smuggle in. Let's just take the Call of Duty example. How would a recon unit address that sort of situation? You're tasked at, the commander knows that you've got an area, a porous problem, you got to solve it. They haven't decided the method to solve it yet because they don't have the information yet. That's the human and the recon ground terrain. You've only done map recon. How would you address that as like a reconnaissance element within a greater force that has not yet arrived?
So that would definitely be a sustained reconnaissance into surveillance mission. A big thing that drives all this stuff, right, is logistics, and you kind of started touching on that idea of we're reconnaissance, so we're going to operate in small teams because small teams move faster and easier to hide ourselves, and then so we can task organize. Even though I might have an 8-man team, I can split that into 2 4-man teams. We have redundant capabilities, so now I can cover a wider area and deliver that information But knowing I don't yet have, the larger unit is still not there. So I'm really now looking at shaping operations. Because it's on the border, I probably don't have, any kind of indirect fire support. I probably don't have any kind of close air support, maybe overflights and stuff like that, but nothing that can deliver ordnance for me. And if I'm going to be facing cartels who I know are well equipped and well armed, they're going to be traveling in larger groups than I am. So that would lead me to one, even if I do separate that 8-man team into 2 4-man elements, we are always going to remain mutually supporting of each other. And then 2, that's going to cause us to carry more ammunition than, say, perhaps the previous scenario where, it was more of a semi-permissive to permissive environments and contact isn't as likely. So, I don't need to go in as heavy. Now I need to go in heavier because I don't have that external fire support. And I need to be able to provide my own. So we go in, a little bit heavier on the ammo side. But also considering the environment and, how far would the cartel pursue us and, how far would it take for, say, Border Patrol or local authorities to reinforce as well. Probably wouldn't need to do the 12 mag loadout, but I'd still be looking at 8 to 10. 8 was generally my minimum anyways for that kind of a mission. But yeah, you're looking at sustaining in the field for a long time, so that's a lot of both looking at your terrain and, if there's those rivers and lakes, then we would want to ensure that our routes in between observation posts and hide sites cross those water features so we can resupply ourselves. That would also be planned resupplies, ensuring, because, you can only play with fire for so long before you get burned and you keep siphoning water off the land. Eventually somebody is probably going to get sick, so you try to get resupply of, good, fresh, clean water from somewhere else when you can. But then food, that's another thing. Like, you can forage off the land here and there to supplement what you bring out. But unless you're hunting, you can't really use that to sustain in the field. So we would definitely need resupplies of food. Batteries, that's another one a lot of people, generally don't think about. So you got to get more batteries. So there would be points where we'd have to pull back to a safer area where the likelihood of being observed by an adversary or otherwise is low to none. We get resupplied and we push back out, and you might be out there for 15, 20 days, continuously getting resupplied and getting eyes on, either a new area or continuing surveillance. So if you find a particular area of interest, where there's constant border crossings, you might rotate teams, through that area, so that there's never a gap in your observation and surveillance.
Okay. Yeah, because I imagine that your objective is partially for surveillance to define and discover like common travel routes where, say, your targets are your whatever your cause of being there is moving, and then the other one is to look for known danger areas. Like, for example, this mountaintop is controlled by this, is controlled by the cartel or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's not. It has no relation to our operation, so and it doesn't threaten our operation, or the cost of it is too. Okay. Yeah,
it goes like your terrain analysis, before a mission, and so you can look on the map and be like, all right, well, here's a dry riverbed, and there's a big ass mountain over here that would have observation of it at least. Mm-hmm. So that's a spot we're going to want to check out to see if it's already controlled by the cartel in any way. And then there'll be a, plan A, plan B for dealing with that. And then if it's not controlled or does not appear to be controlled, can we establish on that hilltop and use that for our own observation and surveillance? Is it adequate? things like that. So you would have a rough idea of what the key terrain is from your map studies, and then so you want to check those areas out, all that key terrain out, and then find out what those lines of communication are that are being used by the adversary, and then you start really dialing in your efforts based on your initial observations, and you continue to focus your efforts until you've got it down to the main hub of adversary activity.
Alrighty, well so those two things really do help out because they've helped define the difference. Like we were saying earlier, I think one of the issues that happens in just the translation of information is that reconnaissance gets mistaken for long range patrolling, or maybe even long range patrolling, or it gets mistaken for like ranging, where you get the word ranger, where it's like this idea of like basically what we did in a patrol base activity or ranging was that the idea of that activity, which is not commonly used today, it kind of harkens back to a little bit more like conventional to semi-conventional conflict, is that you'd take your group of 30 dudes and they would go deep into enemy territory, setting up targets as they go. Maybe it's an ambush here or it's a raid here or something, and they would have some connection to command, but their primary objective would be to disrupt and destroy opposing forces' capabilities and equipment and so on and so forth, by, instead of pushing a front, inserting into an area and sustaining long-term conflict over there. So they'd hit a raid, make a camp, hit a raid, make a camp, hit a raid, make a camp, or something like that. So that was usually much more action-based. It wasn't reconnaissance and intel, although you'd usually do recon before you hit your targets. That's very different than like a recon Recce position, where we might focus a lot on Recce being, you want to have a longer barrel and you want to be able to carry this many magazines and you need to have a backpack and water and all this kind of stuff. It's like, I think we get mixed up on the gear and forget the mission and the objective and like, what's the purpose very quickly. So that helps out.
Reconnaissance tasks can be incredibly simple. Marine infantry has to maintain a basic standard of conducting a reconnaissance patrol, but their version would be very different, from ours. Theirs would simply like, hey, we need to find out if we can drive trucks up this road. Like, go send a squad. And they're going to go walk the road and be like, yeah, sure. Like, send trucks. Or they'll conduct reconnaissance tasks, but they're going to be very, very short in duration. And they don't really have the tools for doing the sustained operations of sitting there and conducting. Really, where it starts to break down is you getting away from like a reconnaissance task into that surveillance arena. How they're reporting, what they're trained on, how to report. I've done, leadership courses, and a guy was assigned as the platoon commander and tasked with conducting a helo landing zone reconnaissance, and he had no idea what that was. And then in the little smart books they gave us, he had a helo landing zone brief, which is like a few lines, that you call into a pilot as they're coming into the zone. And he tried to deliver that, and the instructors were like, no, like, that's all wrong. And they were like, you need to go find, Echo 6 Fox, which was, radio etiquette for go find Flannery. And I had to walk him through, what an HLZ report is, and I pulled out my reporting formats, and I'm like, this is all the information that goes into this. And he's like, holy hell. And then I had to talk to the instructor. So I'm like, you guys can't task, an infantry platoon sergeant with something like this. Like, he's not trained on that.
Gotcha.
You can't hold it against him. He's not trained on it. They're like, yeah, that's fair enough. Like, and so there's just some differences in the level of training and understanding of the task at hand. But everybody can conduct. I mean, a simple thing would be, hunters. They do reconnaissance. When you do your pre-season scouting, that's reconnaissance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Simple enough.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be injected with the silliness and magic of, say, Hollywood. I think is probably the best way to say it. Like there's the Hollywood approach of like Jason Bourne. What Jason Bourne did to situational awareness is like I want to make sure that doesn't happen to like the concept of reconnaissance, where he almost has like supernatural sense. It's like, okay, dude, like situational awareness is being present at the dinner table. It's not being, like it's not the most super secret squirrel identifying the 3-degree difference on the lock and the pick and the thing. It's like, no, dude, it's like you're there. When you're at a restaurant and somebody is acting out of regs or out of unusual, you pay attention to that, but you don't sit there and pull out binos and stare at him to try to figure out if his shirt collar being folded a certain way identifies him as a KGB spy. Like, okay,
Yeah.
Cool. So let's roll right into. Let's actually breach the break the mold and jump into that kit conversation. You've mentioned a couple times where you would take your gear and you'd scale it and you would change it to the operation or the mission set that you were kind of designated towards. And everybody knows in the joking format that if you want to sell something to the military, just say it's modular. So yeah, it doesn't work, but it's modular. And like, I'll take 10.
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time in gun culture writ large, focusing on gear and paying attention to what we're doing and sort of justifying our purchases and justifying our setups. And whether you're in the military, when you take I remember taking a magazine, an AR magazine, and putting it on my belt, and I had to like explain to my team why I was doing that. And they were like, and some of it was in the area where like you modify anything a little bit and suddenly you're just one of those weird gear guys that can't be trusted.
Yeah.
He's always going to try something new. And it changed. I think the pendulum swung the other way where now you had people doing all sorts of weird gizmos and gadgets and whatever. How did you approach gear before you left the military, and how do you approach gear after leaving the military? Big picture.
Leaving the military, I had planned on doing contracting overseas. I hadn't planned on the social media or really any of it. So I was actually like just trying to get rid of like all my gear because I had a plate carrier for direct action. I had a whole other setup for maritime. I had a swimmer's belt for diving and swimming. I had my chest rig, and I had other chest rigs, and I had rucks. And I'm like, I'm not going to need all this. I need to keep like one good plate carrier that is actually scalable and modular and can be minimal or can be built up. And my gun belt, and I kind of just want to get rid of everything else. And I did. And that's how I approached it with leaving the military. Is I don't need a chest rig anymore that's really capable of doing anything, because the only chest rig I would need now would be when I go hunting, which is just like a bino harness, right? That's all I need for a chest rig now. So I just tailored, my equipment to what my specific needs were going to be, because I no longer had to support the different mission sets that I had to while I was still active duty. While I was active duty, what I started trying to do towards, I'd say the last 8 years was that whole modular and scalable type thing. Because I didn't like having two different plate carriers, for two different mission sets. I didn't like having the different gun belts. I didn't like having all this different equipment that I kept in different bags. And then there are so many things that had to go from kit to kit. So like your IFAK has to get pulled out of one and put into the pouch on the other, and your tourniquet's got to come out and this and that. So then I started Well, now instead of doing that, I'll just build an IFAC in every single one, and I'll have, all the tourniquets in every setup, and it's just all this gear and equipment, and then naturally things like, I don't know how many times I lost my Garmin wrist GPS. Not because I actually lost it, but because I secured it in a pouch somewhere in one of my kit bags, and then I couldn't friggin' find it again. And I would do that all the time, and I would buy another thing, and then once I bought the quote-unquote replacement, then I would find the other one. And it's like, it was a mess, and so I wanted to kind of get away from that. And that's the tricky side of being in a unit like that, where you really truly have to support different mission sets, is all of that equipment that you have to manage. So I really started looking at how to do that better, and what I started doing is we finally got gear cages instead of just old wall lockers, just cramming everything in wall lockers. We had cages, so I just hung everything up in my cage. And it'd be like, all right, we're going to do a raid, so grab the plate carrier, gun belts with it, here's my nav gear, here's this, here's that. That all goes into the kit bag, and now I'm bringing that to the assembly area. Come back from the mission, put it all back up, hang it out. Next thing is a reconnaissance task. Okay, we don't need armor on this one. We're going to run chest rig, so I'll grab my chest rig. I'll grab this thing, I'll grab that thing, and that way I just put it all into a bag, take that to the assembly area, and that's where I would do the final prep of setting it up, and that made things a little bit easier. And then even looking at the individual setups, like the chest rigs and the plate carriers, which were the two big ones I had to roll with, I started looking at how, rather than having like 3 or 4 different plate carriers, how can I just have one plate carrier that I can quickly scale up or down to fit, various mission sets, and then fit the specifics within that, the tasks within that mission. Because you might conduct reconnaissance in body armor. Because there have been times where I've been tasked with, you're going to conduct reconnaissance and surveillance, and you're also going to be charged with then establishing an ambush position. Well, it's like, okay, well, if I'm planning on getting into a fight, I'm going to have armor. And so we've done, missions with armor on. But then sometimes you don't want, only 4 on your plates, 1 on the belt, 1 on the gun. Now maybe I want 8 mags, plus 1 on the belt, 1 on the gun. So can I scale that up? So that's been a big thing that I was like, kind of the holy grail that I was going after, especially these last few years before I retired. And then the year since, a year plus since I've retired, I've kind of kept my eye on things. I have not been trying to really accrue more gear, but it's been kind of happening because of the social media thing. So like I did end up getting enough equipment. I rebuilt, my old Recce rig, built my old chest rig, and the internet went insane because it has 12 mags on it. But even that is scalable. I can actually remove a lot of the mag carriers inside of it, and it doesn't affect how that rig rides or wears. So if I don't need the 12 magazines, I can scale that down to 8. The rig doesn't feel different. Nothing changes with my manual of arms or ammo management, and then I just go conduct that mission. Easy day.
Okay, cool. Because I've noticed a couple of things when it comes to gear and like the social element around equipment is that we spend a lot of time sort of justifying our decisions to each other, especially on the veteran civilian side. Like, oh, I got this for this purpose in case this happens, or I use it this way, or it'll help me in this arena, this competition, this stage, this match, or it'll do this, or it's for this purpose in this kind of defense scenario. And we spend a lot of time doing that. When you are looking, I'm sorry, we spend a lot of time sort of justifying and arguing in defense of our gear selection choices, which oftentimes sort of double as in a moral evaluation of each other. Like, okay, you're doing this. your kit is set up a certain way. Let's just say, you've these are hypotheticals and not real, but like hypothetical one is like, oh, he's got 9 magazines on his plate carrier. He's inexperienced and afraid. Like, okay, well, that's probably not. That's a little bit of a jump, but okay.
Yeah.
Another one would be, there are certain things that you can certainly do when setting up your kit that will be identifiers of naivety. Like and there's just things that you can do. Right?
Yeah, and that was like one of the things that came out when I did display, and I keep looking over because it's over here in the garage, pile of gear. When I first posted that rig, all the early, like, I'd say probably like the 2005 to like 2010 era, GWAT vets. A lot of them started coming, especially the infantry guys, and were like, yeah, I used to always carry like 10 mags and I'd go out and I'd use them all. And I'm like, you use 10 mags in a single firefight. My dude. Let's have conversations. And that led to like other posts I've done, like, hey, what is suppressive fire actually? Like, if you are carrying a rifle, your job is not suppressive fire. And this is something I would teach. I taught our basic reconnaissance course for 4 years. And I'm like, you don't do suppressive fire. Your version of suppression is destruction. You take a well-aimed shot at a bad guy when he presents himself, and your goal is to kill that bad guy so he can't get back up and do anything else. Right? That's your job. That is how you will suppress the enemy. Like, suppression can work in a sense for a larger unit, but even when you go think about the infantry, if you have riflemen who are just throwing lead in the air and not hitting their targets, you actually have an ineffective fighting force.
Very much so. And it seems to be within like small unit tactics, we hopefully could find a way to spend more time on individual proficiency. Because I remember you were talking, I watched this clip. You're talking about, suppressive fire. If you're engaging a baddie, a bad dude, you're not like, rounds that go over the head are considerably less effective than rounds that are hitting right in front of the person. So it's kicking up debris. It's a psychological thing. There's the crack versus like the thuds, the impact of the bullet hitting my cover. And so I can like the concept. I think it was very well delivered, and I'm not trying to make your red beard match your blush on your face, but sorry. Not meant to be derogatory, but the point on that one is I also remember doing react to contact and react to ambush drills in the military, and we kind of had this idea of being taught just when you make contact you provide an overwhelming fire. Withering fire, or not even withering fire, but you provide an overwhelming response in conflict, a fire, and then you establish establish a base of fire and a flanking maneuver, and that's it. Yeah. And I could remember, I don't know if private me would have been able to have the mental wherewithal to consider when I'm there doing Battle Drill 1 Alpha in a company level or platoon level engagement to think about hitting the barricade in front of my target as opposed to the air above him. But that definitely harkens into becoming more skilled and more attentive. And if I had thought about that earlier, it probably would have helped me down that road faster.
And I look back, and I guess I'm just I'm lucky because when I started in the infantry, we would do a basic fire maneuver range where you've got the little bobbing Ivan targets, you hit them twice and they go down and they'll spring back up. And either they're built into a berm on a range, or like you're carrying them out and you're sandbagging them into bunkers to protect the motor. And it was like, hey, if you shoot the target down and you're waiting for it to bob back up because you're still rushing forward and there's no other targets in your lane, shoot the sandbags. It's like, shoot the sandbags. And it's like, why would I just shoot the sandbags? It's like, well, if you shoot that guy, you don't know for a fact that he's down because you're 200 yards away. But if you, occasionally put a round into that top sandbag, that would discourage him from popping back up, especially if you did hit him and that's why your target dropped. Definitely going to be discouraged from getting back up if he's been hit and now you're still pinging that cover. So he's like, yeah, if I stand back up, I'm just going to get shot again. Like, this is stupid. I'm not doing it. And that's one less gun in the fight. Even though they're not dead, or there may not even be, unable to carry on, they might still be perfectly able to carry on the fight. But the fact that they're dealing with a gunshot and the fact their cover is still getting hit, you are actually achieving effective suppression. But that still requires a degree of accuracy. I have to actually still aim for a fine point downrange and hit that point or as close to it as I can. I saw it way too often, and I hear it in the testimonies of people who make comments on my posts on social media about just sending rounds, and you see it in a lot of the old videos, and dude on a rooftop who just burns down 10 rounds, and you're like, where did those go? Like,
West.
I was trained in the infantry, and I have continued to train infantrymen, and there is no one I know, including myself, who can burn down 10 rounds that quickly at a target 200 yards away and be like, oh yeah, all 10 of those are hitting.
No, yeah.
Because we also...
Okay.
Yeah,
no, you can go for a while, and I think it's very useful information because, again, it's like, I think the military, in a lot of its instruction and its training, for those who are outside of the military, is seen with a certain level of like mysticism of how, like, oh, he's tactically trained, and it's like, that doesn't mean anything, dude. That means literally nothing. What really matters is that, like, I've had the opportunity to like walk through a house with a gun and pull the trigger, which is rare. And so for many people, the actual advantage of like tactical training is that it's not the first time they've done something.
Yeah.
For whoever they're in conflict with or whoever they're fighting, it's likely their first time doing something. And that's a big difference where I've had the time, even if I'm not Super Delta Army Navy SEAL guy who's like figured every single micro movement out to, the this muscle versus the this muscle in my arm as I'm pieing a door, at least it's not the first time I've been through that and had to present a rifle and engage a target. Whereas for, I think we forget very quickly, for many, if not most people, especially people in conflict, their first time shooting at a person is probably one of their first times shooting at all, or shooting at a living target, even a living target. And so the Pareto distribution comes into play on one hand, and then the other one is when it comes to training and especially contemporary tactics, is that with things like react to contact, break contact, react to ambush, is that most one thing that's very different in contemporary conflict than older conflict is, in our day and age, most engagements end in an overwhelming and crushing victory or defeat. No one gets up from it. The other team, whatever you're fighting against, does not retreat to recover and then have a counterattack. It's like, it's all or nothing, instead of the older days where it's like, well, we crippled your fighting force and you're able to retreat over the mountain. Now it's like, there is nobody left. It's a smaller unit, but there's nobody left. If we successfully establish a base of fire and flank, there will be no survivors, or there will be very small. And so, like, it's very different. That's been a hard psychological change in how we think about conflicts and engagements, and Napoleon had his influence in that one. And so when that comes to small unit tactics and movement, the strategy isn't to defeat your opponent. It's just to completely, utterly crush them with no response, no like recourse. They can't get back at you. You're not ambushing somebody to see who gets away. It's just the entire unit's gone. You're trying to make the entire military operations evaporate, basically.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, when that goes into like a kit conversation, then you're talking about scalability on a plate carrier, and scalability is a term that I think could be defined a little bit better. What do you mean by scale? What do you mean by scalability? Like, what does that look like? Because, and what's a good example of a plate carrier? I don't need like an endorsement of Spiritus Systems or Faro Concept or whatever, but like, what's a good example of a plate carrier that does it well? And what's a good example of one that lacks the features necessary, or one that's just way too much?
So, I mean, you kind of hit it. A lot of the companies are coming out with, these minimalist setups where you just have like a front plate bag and a rear plate bag, and your rear plate bag just has like molly all the way down the back, and your front, it's got a little bit of molly on the chest, and then you set that big pile field so that you can, you can build that out to whatever it may be. You can put, so like mine, I've got radio wings, so I carry both my radios just off to the side of each side of my plate bag.
For those who are listening, pile field is soft side Velcro.
Yes.
That's just...
Sorry, airborne things.
Yeah, no, I get it, dude. I get it.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
I forget. So then you
hand me that hundo tape.
Yeah.
What?
We call it rigger tape.
Why is it gray? I want the green stuff, the real good.
Yeah. The radio wings, and like, I had a pouch that, a large dangler pouch for breaching, and then I could swap out my placard, like, am I the shotgun and the primary breacher? Well, I'm going to put this placard on. Okay, I'm not shotgun or primary, so I'm going to put a regular mag placard, and I'm going to move some of my mags from my cummerbund to my front now, because I prefer that they be there. But if I'm a breacher, I got to dedicate that front placard to breaching. Or I'm not breaching at all, any way, shape, or form, well, then I can just remove that whole breaching pouch and cut that weight. I only have one radio for this mission, fine. Pull the other radio wing off, don't need it. And it's all, Velcroed on, so it's really easy to remove. And same thing with some of the cummerbund setups is they're Velcro on and off. So you could even potentially have different cummerbunds already pre-set up. So like, okay, we want to wear plates on this mission, but we don't think we don't feel like we need side plates. So I can just rip off this cummerbund and slap on a different one that doesn't have side plates on it. And, maybe one is set up for 5.56, the other one's set up for 7.62 because I'm running an M110 on this mission rather than, a Mark 18 or an M4. So there's scalability in that right there, like the ability to quickly, not weaving molly in and out. Like, I love the molly system for that kind of different modularity, but it's not something you want to be sitting there and quickly like hot swapping. But all that Velcro does enable that. And then you can look at a lot of companies are making pouches that have more than one use. I will plug them, and I say it all the time. Cry Precision has their Smart Pouch Suite, and basically they took the idea because what guys were doing was like using their magazine pouches and just shoving some other item in there, like turning an M4 mag pouch into a small IFAC. That was a common one. Using it to hold a signal panel, right? So now companies are kind of taking cues off that and redesigning the fit and form of their pouches and what they're capable of so that they can provide various things. I've got frag pouches that I can drop in 12 gauge inserts instead of frags. Now I get 5 extra rounds of 12 gauge. I've got a utility pouches where I can carry flashbangs, I can carry 40 mic, I can carry, signaling materials like based off the inserts that I throw in and out of there. And now there's even a company who's making a thing where like you can turn a molly pouch into a clip-on, clip-off deal from your belt. So if you had seriously, like we had guys, you might be assigned, issued the M249, the saw, but if we're doing raids, majority of the time you just have your M4. But then there may come a time, and this happened, where we're doing a longer infill. We expect contact, and so we want that larger volume of fire. So now that guy had to carry his M249, but his rig was set up for M4. So he had his normal rig, and he had to open up his chest rig and throw his patrolling chest rig over the top of his plate carrier. So it was super bulky, it was super uncomfortable. But if we had equipment that was more scalable, he could have just swapped out the cummerbund, maybe added some pouches, a couple drum pouches to his belt, and without making drastic changes to your setup, be capable of accomplishing a different task, whether that's carrying a different weapon, carrying more ammunition than what is standard, or carrying less ammunition than what is standard. And the big thing with it being scalable is you don't want your gear to feel different, right? It's just it's enough. It's enough for what it needs to be, but you're not like relearning your whole setup, right? You just kind of change some things, but everything still flows the way it should. It fits the way it should. There's no gross adjustments that need to be made. That's really like the whole idea of being scalable and truly modular, is I can change it to fit the mission, which really, for majority of the forces that are out there, don't need that much, right? The biggest thing that a lot of, like, we'll go to infantry would need in scalability is going from climate to climate. If my rig is sized for me to be working in the jungles, all right, hot, humid, cool, not wearing any layers, so it's going to be pretty snug. Then I go up into the mountains, I need to loosen that up because I'm going to have layers underneath, and I don't want the plates crushing those layers because then they're not doing their job, and I'm going to start sweating and yada, yada, yada. So I need to be able to quickly refit the carrier. But for an infantryman, typically your SOP loadout is going to be your SOP. You're going to have 6 or 7 mags on your fighting load plus 1 in the gun, and that's really going to be your standard. But even then, the Marine Corps is talking about trying to issue out pistols to every infantryman. So that's going to be a thing where, like, they have to figure that out, because you don't always want a pistol, when you're going out into the bush. It's a nice to have if you're going to be in close quarters fighting. It's nice to have that pistol in case something happens with your rifle. But there's going to be times where you don't want that. So, how can I adjust my gear and not have it feel drastically different without that pistol, or when I add it back in?
There are plenty of operations I went on where I didn't bring a handgun. I had my AR-15 and a knife, or I had my M4 and a knife. I had my M4 and a hatchet. That's it. Like, I did nothing else. I didn't bring a handgun. I didn't bring a sidearm. I had a team for that. And there are there are times where it was appropriate, and that is an interesting piece. I think that's an interesting piece that gets lost in translation. That in some time there, like. Maybe I'd put it this way. You're on a real op when you're going out and you're cutting the handgun for weight and for its utility, because it's like, well, I mean, the only time this would happen is like, an emergency generic scenario. But I think a lot of that too has changed because our the equipment that we have for holsters and technology is actually a lot better in the last 10 years. I think that's one thing that's easily forgotten. Is like, you look at holsters in 2009, dude, those were some rough years. Yeah,
if you didn't have a Safariland, like, you had a really crappy holster. And even, like, Safariland is great, but even, the thumb belt only, the SLS Safarilands, like, they're a little bit slower to draw from than some of the, more modern systems. If you didn't have it, it was like this, like, sweet spot of tensioning the holster to where the gun doesn't like rattle like maraca, but then it's also still easy to draw, and it's not like stuck in the holster and trying to find that. And then when you start running, it doesn't matter; it still makes noise as you run. And so half the time, like, you feel the need to like keep a hand on it not because you're afraid of losing it, but because you don't want it to make noise as you finish a sprint, up to a certain point, and you haven't been compromised yet.
Yeah.
But now they're a lot better, so they're a lot more secure. So you could run with your pistol in the holster, and it's not going to make a whole bunch of noise, and it's going to be more secure. But Atopia's always asked me in courses and classes, like, would you carry a pistol in the bush? I'm like, no. Like, unless I know I'm going to go get into a close quarters fight, like I am intentionally going to be breaching a building or jumping into trenches with somebody, I'm not going to carry a pistol. There's really not a need for it, especially if I was conducting a reconnaissance mission where I'm not supposed to make contact at all. I'm not going to carry a pistol. It's one more thing that I have to put on all my gear. It's that much more weight I have to carry. It's more things I have to manage. It's just extra, right? So I don't need to carry it. And even going into all the raids that I did, the only times that I ever drew the pistol was intentionally. Like, I was like, you know what? I want to draw this because I want to be the guy to get a bad dude with my 1911, because we still carry 1911s. I was like, I want to be the guy because no one's gotten anybody with a 1911 yet. And then, I'd make entry, and of course the room would be empty, and I'd be like, damn it. And I'd put it away, and I'd go back to my rifle because that's what makes sense. I just got a wild hair up my ass a few times.
Climbing a ladder, driving a vehicle, these kind of things. Yeah, there are scenarios. I think vehicle, like if you're spending a lot of time, especially in a soft skin vehicle, that's definitely a time I'd want to have a handgun. Yeah. A lot of time in something that's not an MRAP or a striker or a tank or whatever, something like that. Yeah, the handgun one was is it kind of a goofy direction. I think a lot of that can be driven from culture outside of application. It's just
I think it's a Call of Duty thing.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing where I stand is like I remember I played Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 12 years ago because there was Rangers in it and I was in the Rangers and I was like, oh, I'm going to go play me.
Yeah.
Because you're like 20 years old and that's what you do. So fine. But
one of the times I advocated for pistols in the field was we still had, I don't remember their nomenclature was, but the suppressed 22s.
Never had, dude. You're the Marine Corps. I never had those. Never saw them. But those things are suppressed 22 handguns. A lot of fun.
We still had some in the armory, and I was like, we should probably carry those. And at the time, we also weren't normally carrying our suppressors out. And I was like, we should probably carry those, and we should probably put our suppressors on our guns at least once we're in position, so that if we have to, somebody bad guy stumbles on our hide site, like, yeah, it's not silent. A rifle at least is not silent, but it's a hell of a lot less noticeable than an unsuppressed gunshot. And especially if you go into Iraq or Afghanistan, where there's kind of fairly frequently, shots going off because it's a war zone. You buy yourself some time, and then the idea behind the suppressed 22 is like that is definitely quiet. But then it's also like, but it's a 22, so you have to be super close for it to be effective. So it's like, we did the pros and cons. We decided, we won't bother with the suppressed 22, but we did start, the practice of get in position, mount your suppressor, and then when we were moving, we would typically not have them mounted because it's just extra weight on the front end of your gun.
Yeah, seeing people opt against using a suppressor is pretty odd for me. I think I've always been like, well, if you can, you should. In most scenarios, there are some scenarios where it's like, okay, whatever, but it's been a pretty generic like slider bar. Yes, if you have the opportunity, at least in most I guess in most scenarios. But then I'm also limiting myself to like the amount of experience that I've had, which has been almost entirely night raids.
Yeah, there's that, and then. For us, we still have the Marine Corps still uses the Knight's armament. What I always forget its nomenclature.
We used them too. They're heavy.
Yeah, it's a Knight's armament can, so it is a heavier can. But then the whole thing was like, well, like they're okay in sound suppression, but then they don't have the greatest lifespan as far as the rounds that could be put through them. So you would almost never use them in training because you wanted to save them for combat. But by the time you deploy, you've gotten so used to just always leaving the suppressor behind that you get like a third of the way through deployment. You're like, oh, why aren't we using our suppressors now? And it's like, oh, yeah, we have those things. They're all locked in a can in our armory crate somewhere. Like, let's break those things out and maybe start using them. And then so you use them for, certain periods of deployment. You come back, and then like that whole cycle starts all over again.
Funny. Yeah, we didn't have that issue. You stepped foot Oconus and you were just like, dink, done. It never leaves the gun.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a difference. But I've noticed that too, because like you have, as much as there's a lot of like rivalry and arguments between the different SOCOM units and branches and whatever, I've seen things where like I was taught this trick by a SEAL, which I taught to a private who eventually taught it to a SEAL, and like what goes around comes around. Like it's just it's odd how like small things go. The last conversation I want to talk about gear is sound. And because I don't want to I'm trying not to get too focused in on gear, but one thing that I've noticed is as a person becomes more experienced and capable with it, whether it's in movements in the field or in an urban environment, they become less and less noticeable by sound. And if you're approaching a subject, oftentimes sound is the thing that gives you away, not sight, especially at night. Mm-hmm. So you would see guys spend time, usually guys who had a little bit more experience, at least at approaching the team leader level, and they would go through all of their gear and they'd find all the ways to make everything as quiet as possible. Now I do that with my rifles and my carbines and stuff, and that makes sense. It's always been it's something that I've gotten better at and more consistent with, because there's nothing louder than a metal buckle swinging and hitting the aluminum of or the polymer of your magazine, and that's just loud. Yeah. But when it comes to kit, what were some things that you did deliberately to reduce your noise signature, which sounds too technical? How'd you make your shit not make noise?
So one thing was, everybody likes to have like their admin pouches and utility pouches on their gear. And, I did that too. What I noticed is like that stuff just kind of floats around in there. So the first thing I started doing was, I would have a handful of like camouflage handkerchiefs. So like I'd pull my 14s off, my night vision off, and I'd wrap it in a handkerchief, and it wasn't for protection. So when I put it in the utility pouch, it didn't move. And like everything would be wrapped in like handkerchiefs or like little camo nets so that it wouldn't shift inside the pouches themselves. But then I started looking at, well, how much of this stuff do I actually need like on my fighting load? Because the whole purpose of the fighting load is to carry items that make holes and fill holes. So, all your bullets, your stabby sticks, radio, and your first aid. Take life and save life. So these other things, like, do I really need them in that, or can I put those in other places? And when I got into Recon, they introduced me to the idea of actually wearing, fanny packs. It's like, hey, we wear these, and you put like your survival items and your pocket items in there, so you don't have pocket items, which is a good idea. But then again, you start taking like lighters and chapstick and signal mirrors and cami paint and little pocket knives and all these little things, and you just throw them into a fanny pack, and then you shake that fanny pack. It's like a tactical Morocco. So then again, it's like, well, maybe some of these items I should keep in a pocket, like a pocket knife. I can probably still keep that in a pocket. It's more accessible that way. It's one less thing to rattle inside my fanny pack. Wrapping rigger's tape around a lighter, which one, gives me a means of carrying rigger's tape into the field, and two, it dulls the sound of a plastic Zippo, smacking against something else. And wrapping things in tape and buffering them with handkerchiefs and trying to pack things so that they're very tight, even in the ruck. Packing things so that they're tight and the items can't even shift within the pouch that they're stored in. and then removing a lot of like superfluous items, because things are a lot easier like to secure inside your pack, because you can wrap them up real tight. Like, my LZ kit, my landing zone kit, I don't need that on my person. That's something that I'll stop and I'll pull out of my ruck and I'll set up a landing zone. So it doesn't need to be on me, and I can then secure it very tightly and neatly inside my ruck. And that way it doesn't make any noise. And it's one less thing I have to have, on my chest rig or my plate carrier. So that was always, my approach. And again, like when I came in, for whatever reason, there just seemed to be a higher insistent on, basic fieldcraft of noise and light discipline. So, taping your sling when you pulled it from the armory to go out in the field was standard practice. It was like, tape your sling, because back then, I'm talking 2002, when I first hit the Marine Fleet Force, we still had the old parade slings on M16A2s. So, like, all these metal buckles, so it's like, tape all that crap up, because it shines and it makes noise. Tape it up. Some guys wouldn't even use slings, because, they didn't have that much utility to them, the way that they mounted to the guns back then, and they just made noise. So it's like, I only have a rifle, I don't need to sling it, I'll just carry a rifle without a sling. Guys would go that far. But yeah, really the big thing was just making sure that everything fit snug and tight inside the pouches so that it can't shift around. Because when you jump up and down, the load itself is going to move. Your plate carrier might shift up and down, but as long as the whole thing, when you jump up, the whole thing comes up and shifts down just that little bit, that's okay. That's going to make a little bit of noise. Your assault pack, when you jump up and down, it might come off your back just a little bit. But if that's all you hear is that slight shifting of nylon and nylon, or nylon on your shirt, like that's acceptable. We can deal with that. But if I hear your magazines clinking, if your knife is hitting against something, your wires are clacking against each other, hitting the PTT, that's a problem. So we need to figure that. So, wrapping things in like a camo form tape, or 100-mile-an-hour tape, or changing their position, are all little things that can be done to make that equipment as quiet as possible. Water is a big one, which is why I like soft containers compared to hard ones, like a standard 1-quart canteen or an Nalgene bottle. Those are really hard to keep quiet, because you have to overfill them until like the water's flowing over the sides, and then cap it really quick and try to limit the air. But if you have like a 2-quart canteen, a US 2-quart canteen, you can squeeze it, you fill it, and then put the cap on and squeeze. And as soon as you start seeing a little bit of water come out, you tighten it up. Now there's no air inside that canteen, so it can't slosh. You fill a Camelback, turn it upside down, and squeeze and suck the air out. There's no air, so therefore the water can't move around and slosh. So now you've silenced your water sources.
Yeah, I know. I mean, even if a Camelback's you take the air out, it can still move. I mean, the water will still, because it's a long, oblong object, but you can roll that down and wrap a bungee around it. Like you can heavily reduce the sound on even a Camelback. Or another one being like your hose, if you're running a Camelback hose or any sort of like water, whatever you want to call them, that's a generic term. Is that like running into hitting your PTT or your that was one that you could always tell, because you'd see a guy running and just clack, 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 clack. You could hear the cap of that just going smack, smack right into his plates. Yeah, the sound one is always a tricky one too, because it's also like you can hear how people walk and how they change the way that they walk in different environments, and how they step, and the shoes that they wear is a little bit of a little bit of a thing. I think people put a little bit too much attention to it. Like me, myself included, like I am part of the Vans wearing club, because they are soft. I like the way they feel, and they are quiet, but they're not. I also have my boots, and I've got my desert boots and my city stuff, but I don't mind the skate shoes. They're nice and very, very, very quiet when you get very, very, very attentive. But it's not like it's magic. It's also, it just makes what you can already do just a little bit better if you can figure that part out. So I know that we've kind of played some jokes on that kind of stuff in the past. So let's move on. Let's jump into maybe a little bit more of a less physical question, right? So you've moved out of the military, you've retired, and now you're in what we could say is a very different environment. You know, who are you training? You run a training company. Who are you training most of the time?
So through my little company, because I'm right here by Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, I'd say about 50% of my customers are Marines. Though with that, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a toss up. Like a good number of those Marines have left the service, but they're still in the area. So I've had a lot of guys who are about to get out or have recently ended their active service after 4 years, and so they come through the classes, and I think for them, it's just kind of a way to ease their transition in a sense, because they kind of get to immerse themselves in a familiar environment. And it helps that I still talk like a Marine a lot of times, so I can speak their lingo. But then I get a good, that's 50% of my customer base is Marines from the local area. I get a handful of civilians, and I've gotten a few law enforcement officers. One of whom came all the way up from Florida, took 2 separate classes with me all the way up from Florida. But the others just, regular everyday civilians that are interested in firearms for one reason or another. Some are simply interested for the defensive use aspect. I have one gentleman who wants to start shooting 3-gun competitions, but all he's ever done is stand in a stall and shoot a stationary target at 15 yards, and he knows he's not very good, so he's been seeking, professional instruction so that he can start going and shooting, competitions. So it's a decent mix, and then through my company, I do, like I said in the beginning, I teach with Orion Training Group. So basically anything that happens on the East Coast, Jared reaches out. He's like, "Hey, can you support?" And because of my schedule, it's always a yes. And those are a pretty healthy, again, mix of like law enforcement and civilian. I get more law enforcement customers when I train through Orion. And I enjoy it because it's good to see law enforcement and everyday citizens kind of rubbing elbows with one another, and getting that reminder that we're all on the same side here. We're all just people, and that it's okay that everyone is seeking additional training, and it makes the citizens feel better that there's law enforcement officers. It shows there's still guys that do actually care and are trying to better themselves, because almost always they're there of their own volition. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Handful of military guys here and there, and some of the Orion classes. But it is difficult, obviously, for the military guys to get away from work. And a lot of the classes I teach on the East Coast aren't that close to a base. So for the guys who probably been in the field all week, to then get out of the field on a Friday evening and drive 5-6 hours to a venue and train with me for a day or a weekend and then go back, that's a fairly tall order. So
very much so, yeah.
Don't get too many military guys with most of the OTG courses. Really just the ones I teach locally here to Camp Lejeune.
So the training question also I kind of want to dig into a little bit deeper into like what kind of training you think is coming down the pipeline that might be, I'm not saying the next newest trend, but 5 years ago, Civi CQB classes wasn't the thing. I mean, it really just kind of wasn't. And you could find, like, if you were very fortunate, you could find one. And another version of it would be, like that. But that's another version is, I don't think Civi CQB classes are the end all be all. I think they're going to change. I think we're going to keep moving around.
And I think 5 years ago, if you found someone who was willing to teach, open enrollment CQB, it was probably somebody who didn't really know that much about it, and not to speak ill of, infantrymen, but if you do 4 years in the infantry, you have definitely trained how to clear a room, but you have definitely not trained it enough to have a good enough understanding to be able to then teach it to civilians at any real level of proficiency.
What do you think it is that makes somebody good at CQB? Like, what is the standard? What is the difference between an amateur and a professional?
Well, the biggest thing is kind of an intangible. It's your ability to process.
Fair.
I've seen tons and tons of guys who can shoot really well. They are excellent shooters. They are, absolute studs when it comes to, physical training. They can bench whatever. They can run as faster than the wind. But they can't think quickly on their feet. We literally had a guy where it was like,
in general, or in the scenarios that we're presenting, because I'm talking about like amateurs and professionals within CQB.
I'm saying it's like in general that that's what I've seen, and that's a big part of it. Is someone who at least has that capacity to move from amateur to professional, is that ability to rapidly process information. That's, to me, that is more important than, your marksmanship ability. It's more important than your understanding of various sets of tactics or how your kit is set up. If you can process very quickly, then you could clear a house with a pistol in your pajamas, and you'll come out of that on top because you'll read the situation and you'll understand what has to happen in fractions of a second. But it's the guys that, again, that have all the equipment in the world, all the setups. They can shoot like hell on the range. They're in excellent shape, but they can't process the information fast. Even if they can relay the tactics to you, they could repeat you verbatim out of your handbook what you're supposed to do to clear a room. But then when you actually put them in the room and it's a truly dynamic environment where there is a living, breathing adversary, and they don't get to know what the layout of the room is going to be, what the lighting conditions are going to be. They have no control over the environment, which is how it happens in reality. They lack. And those guys, end up falling behind. And then from there, it turns you someone who can understand principle and apply principle rather than a rigid doctrine. Like, this is the only way to go through a door. This is the only way to reach a point of domination in a room. This is the only way to clear. This is the only way to go down a hallway. If that's all you understand, and again, that's why those guys who did 4 years in the infantry or 8 years in the infantry and get out and try to teach CQB don't always do so well, because they only understand very rigid doctrine that they didn't get that much practice with. Whereas you take someone else who's been doing it for so long, we all start out that way. We all start out, we are taught usually a pretty rigid doctrine of like, this is the way you're going to do it, and this is the only way you're going to do it, and every way else isn't going to work. And you're like, got it, roger that, I'm a private, you're a sergeant, that's what you say, that's how it is. But then you come back around that training, and now you've been in for a few years, and somebody different is training you, and they change something. You're like, well, I thought it was this. They're like, no, that's wrong, it's this. But
I refer to that as orthodoxy and reform.
That happens so many times, you start to realize, like, wait, hold on a second. All of those methods worked, but they don't all work all the time. And you start realizing that there are principles, like I need to use angles. I need to use speed, surprise, violence of action. I need to be able to process very well. And that goes back into like, if I want to be able to process very well, then I want to make sure I'm taking the time on the range to hone my skills. So that when I enter a room, I'm not having to think about, okay, there's a target, I can shoot it, where do I need to put my sights? Okay, I'm bringing my sights up. Okay, I see my sights. Yeah, that looks like that's good. Okay, let me pull the trigger. Now see what happened. Okay, yeah, I think that's good. Let me pull the trigger again. Like, you have to just be able to come up, pop up, and continue on because you honed that skill on the range.
So processing power, is that you're not making the argument that is, well, are you, how would a person's genetics come into this situation? Like some people just quite frankly are born with more brain. And I don't mean that like physically. I mean, some people can. We can be extremely crass about it, or we can be real specific. No, some of that does come down to genetics, which is weird.
Does, yeah. You have an innate ability to process that you cannot overcome. Whenever your brain's processor speed is set to, like, that's where you are. And yeah, there are little brain games that you can play to kind of try and clear up the cloudiness a little bit, but you're stuck at the speed you're stuck at, whatever your max may be. So to free up, your RAM or whatever, I'm trying to make computer analogies now.
Yeah, I've heard the RAM analogy before.
Yeah, that's why those individual skills are important. So that's why the range is important. And everyone's looking right now like, oh, I don't want flat range antics. Like, you're right, you don't want antics, but your fundamentals need to be dialed the hell in. Because
Bo Dobuzinski of Defensive Mindset has brought up that before, in the sense of you're training the micro movements so that when you have to do something macro, you can actually do it. You can actually pay attention.
Going back to, I think it was Bruce Lee, who said, like, I don't fear a man who practiced 10,000 kicks one time. I fear the man who practiced one kick 10,000 times. Because that's a good ass kick, right? That other guy, he kind of doesn't really know a whole lot, and he's not going to know what to do. But like, you practice and practice and practice and practice. The whole point is that you have to have the reps and the sets, and they have to be good reps and good sets, all right, to build up those skill sets to push them to that level of unconscious competence. And the more skill sets that you can push to unconscious competence, like something as simple as walking through a door. Like, we all know how to walk through a door, but you put a gun in someone's hand and tell them to walk through a door, and they jack it all up. And they make it super friggin' weird. And they're like, okay, like, no, just walk. Like, just let your gun hang, holster it, whatever. Now just walk through this door. And they walk through the door, and you walk through the door. Okay, now pull your gun back out. And they start making it weird again. Like, no, stop. Do it the way you were doing it when you didn't have the gun in your hand. And you start adding the pieces together, and pretty soon they don't have to think about how they're going to walk through the door. They don't have to think about setting their feet, because it won't matter how their feet are. They'll just be able to walk through that door and do what they need to do. They'll understand, their duties as a 1-man, a 2-man, a 3-man, a 4-man, so on and so forth. And the more you ingrain all of those things, then you have the clarity to dedicate to processing what's in front of you. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you smelling? So, if I'm the 3-man and I'm coming in behind the 2-man, I'm looking over his shoulder. That's part of it. It's like, I'm not just staring at his back and then, oh, there's a room. It's like, I'm staring over the top of him or around his head to see what's in the room. And as soon as he's cleared, my gun's coming up, and I'm automatically snapping to what I see as being dangerous inside the room. I'm not doing my arbitrary that you learn, hey, come up 12 and scan. Like, I've already seen it. So I'm just going to bring my gun up to where that threat is without wasting time scanning. And those little things of minutia that you get through experience and through ingraining all the implied tasks of clear a room. You got to be able to shoot. You got to be able to move. You have to be able to communicate verbally, non-verbally, and all that good stuff. And the more you ingrain those tasks to unconscious competence, the more RAM you have available to you to process the stimulus in front of you.
Yeah, very much so.
So that's the big thing. That is definitely not, and that goes for everything, right? The difference between an amateur ball player and pro ball player is the amount of good sets and reps and the dedication that they've put into their craft. A lot of people love playing basketball, but not everybody makes it to the NBA because not everybody is willing to put in the time to hone their skills to get to that level.
I think within the culture that we're existing in, because neither of us are in the military anymore. There can be a challenge of there isn't an NBA right now. There isn't an NBA for veterans like this. I mean, to be clear, I think some people end up going down different government agency routes.
Yeah.
And that's, like that's their, their direction. Some people end up going into completely different fields. But for the person who's never been in the military and is not seeking to be a world championship USPSA shooter, there isn't an NBA to strive for. And I think the biggest challenge that faces gun culture writ large is that we don't have something to aim at. Or it's not that we don't. Let me rephrase that. Is that the process of defining what we're aiming at is so much more difficult. And there are ways that we've done it before in the past, which have worked maybe for a time, but they're not perfect. And a good example might be something like the NRA, which had its purpose of like kind of being the generic, eventually became the generic Republican gun control advocacy organization. And there were, they had their objectives, and for us to look at something like the ATF brace restriction ban garbage that's coming down the line.
Yeah.
We could say that, our goal is to defeat that, but that's a very short-term goal, because once you defeat it, there's going to be another one. It's going to come in from a different angle, and it doesn't give us something to aim at. And for the NBA, if I'm sitting here and I'm young enough and I fit I have both my legs and both of them work, and I fit all of this organization because I'm not missing any limbs like that. But if I want to get into the NBA, and I don't have prohibiting factors as is, I know that if I can practice basketball enough, it will continuously increase my chances of ending up there. It'll give me more opportunity to end up in the NBA. But in this world that I live in right now, there is no NBA. There's nothing like that. I'm not training. Most people in the civilian world who are learning how to shoot are not training to become a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger or a Force Recon guy. Most people in the civilian world are not buying gear and getting in shape to figure out how to become a SWAT officer or whatever. What about that entire group of people, which probably is the majority of our gun culture, that isn't aiming at something like that? What is their training? What can they do to start solving that question of the why? And do you have an idea? Do you have any ideas on how to answer that question?
So that is definitely a tough one, and it's made equal parts better and worse by, like, every company has to put out its own ideas of standards.
Sure.
And so everyone has their own ideas of standards, which the best thing I would recommend is, you can look at all of them, and look at all and kind of aggregate them together. And it's like, what is the majority of people say is a good time from concealment, draw and fire, 2 rounds at a target, or 2 rounds reload and another 2 rounds, something like that. Because there's a lot of consistency in what types of drills these various companies use for their standards. You can look at the time, and then you kind of, measure yourself off of that. You can look at, what are the standards for like a USPSA Grandmaster, how fast and accurate do they need to be on a given stage? And, can you do that? There's little things like that. But when it comes to, other things, like land navigation or, fieldcraft, there's not really a standard, that you can look at and be like, okay, I need to achieve this standard. It's like anything else you might do, like we drive. Yeah, we have driver's tests, but really the standard is don't break the law and don't crash, right? That's not a huge standard to drive.
Don't die. Don't die in the woods. Don't cut your limbs. Which, like, we see that all the time. You almost get hit by somebody who probably has had a driver's license for like 20 years and they still suck at driving. So if you, take your tasks seriously and go back to the idea of reps and sets, the cleaner you make those reps,
the better you ingrain those tasks, and then your standards, does that get easier, right? Like I want to make a fire utilizing flint or a ferro rod and steel. So you go out and you do it, right? I mean, how you just go in your backyard and start a little tinder pile on fire, and the quicker it becomes for you, and the easier, to the point where you can just go out. You don't have to think about it. You just pick up some materials, you strike it, boom, you've got embers in a flame. And it's like breathing to you. It's like pouring a glass of milk. That's how right? You have trained that task, to that level of either conscious or unconscious competence. So it's like, hey, cool. So now you realize, okay, I keep doing this, and I can hone this and make it better. And what's another thing that maybe I'm not so good at? Well, maybe I want to learn how to make a fire with a bow and a drill, and so you work on that. You want to work on purifying water or your land navigation. The less you have to look at your compass and refer back to your map to get from point A to point B that might be a couple miles apart, the better you're getting at navigation. And that, again, we could draw a parallel to driving. The more you drive a route, the more familiar you become with it, to the point you don't need to use your navigation apps. And then the more you get familiar with your home area, somebody can just tell you what street they live on. And you're like, okay, I know where that's at, and I know the best route to get there. I've never driven to your home before, but I've been through the area. I know the street you're on. I know the fastest way to get to that street from my house, and then I'll drive and I'll find your home.
That's such a Recce. It's such a Recce answer. Oh, I know where you live and I know where to. Like, okay, cool. I did an area study on your neighborhood. I know the demographic difference between your neighborhood and mine. I know that the people in my neighborhood make on average $10,000 more a year than yours. I am a better American.
But yeah, that's kind of the thing with all that, and the easier that tasks become as you do them more often, that's how you kind of know you're reaching a level. But I mean, even within the military, there aren't standards for a lot of these little things that we do that help us actually thrive in the field. There's no standard for how to set up your sleeping system. There's no standard for how exactly you're going to layer based on the temperature and the mission at hand. You kind of just understand the basics of layering and cold winter clothing, and then you conduct your movement. And if you're sweating 1 kilometer into it, you're like, I fucked up. But if you remain comfortably cool the entire time, and you get all the way from start to finish, and you're barely broke a sweat, your clothes are dry, you're decently comfortable, you're like, okay, I did this the right way. Like, I have this figured out now. Footwear, boots, socks, all that stuff. A lot of it is a lot of trial and error, but it's also a lot of going to people who have been there, done that, who can tell you, this is what worked for me. These were the hard lessons I learned when I did it wrong. So this is why I'm suggesting you don't do it this way. And this is what really worked for me. So I'm suggesting that you do it that way instead. And, you try it out. I guess it's kind of the best I can answer with that.
Yeah, it's a tricky question because the more I engage with it, the more it's not that it necessarily gets easier. But when you set a standard is pointing at an ideal. The ideal would be a 0-second draw time with rounds on target. I mean, that would be, there is some more ideal, and although I can't achieve a 0-second draw time, I can still strive towards a fast and accurate draw. And that ideal is, points at the ability to be fast and capable of using my equipment for the purpose of its design to defeat an enemy. You design a tool to solve a problem. You have to start with a problem. And we have both an abundance of problems and a divisive lack of them. And just say culture in general. And you see this in American gun culture so often, is that we all kind of break into our tribes and hate each other. And then something happens. We come together for a little bit and then we break apart again. And maybe American culture writ large does that quite a bit too. And I think there's a bit of a pattern to it. There's a bit of a ebb and flow. A tide comes and goes on that subject, and so the difficulty of setting a target for the culture as a whole is something that can't be ignored. It can't be it can't be looked away from and replaced with rote materialism. But I think that us as citizens of this country have a responsibility to the soil that we stand on, that we will prevent. We will, by our nature of being meritorious individuals, be that bulwark against the encroaching darkness and the tyranny, so that our children grow up in a world that at least isn't worse than ours.
Yeah. And
it's hard to communicate that concept, because we look at all the stuff going on out there. You watch the news, you see the television, you're on your phone, there's whatever you're listening to. It's very easy to get focused out there on how dark things are, and how it's how the world seems like it's getting darker in many ways. But at the same time, that battle is fought with the candle in your hand and not in the blazing torch that you wish was over there. And so gun culture as a whole I think has had a hard time struggling with this idea of maybe boomer FUD materialism, where gun culture was having a collection and whatever. And we kind of rejected that. We returned to some form of utility in some sense, not perfectly. And I find it really interesting that the majority of gun culture tends to be engaging in conversations about who should and shouldn't be teaching, who should and shouldn't be teaching what, and why we're here and why we're trying to figure this stuff out, and all this kind of stuff that goes into veteran suicide, and what are we trying to live for, and what are we trying to train for, and whose family are we trying to survive with. And it's a subject that I think weighs very heavy, because we're all looking at it. It's a hard question to answer. I wish I could say I had a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I've really tried looking at, and it was kind of a push I started making when I really got into the whole social media thing, and I started working with some other pages of other, active duty and recently separated Marines, was trying to reinstill a pride in service, because there was a lack of that, and there still is. Reinstilling that pride of service and reinstilling that sense of community, and rather than that whole sense of division of I'm a grunt and you're a pogue, and I'm a pogue and you're a pogue, but I'm a cooler pogue than you are. My job is more important than yours. It's they're all important. They're all important. They all exist for a reason. So you all have important jobs, and the only thing that makes you better than one person or another is your effort that you're willing to put into it, your individual discipline you're willing to put into your craft and into yourself. If there's someone who is not willing to put that effort into themselves and into their craft and bettering the people around them, then yeah, I would classify that person as being lesser. Then that is translated into what I'm very slowly hoping to accomplish, and what I'm seeing slowly with one class at a time is rebuilding the sense of community. People from different backgrounds are, come together in these classes, and they see each other and they speak with each other. Now, granted, the people who attend classes that I teach are of all the same general political ideology, so that does kind of help them along. But, you've got, again, civilians, law enforcement, the occasional military guy, and they all kind of rub elbows and are reminded, right, that we're all on the same side. We're all striving towards the same goal. And I tried to promote that idea of community. We don't all need to agree. And, from time to time, we're going to say something that's going to piss somebody else off, and that person's probably going to say something. And, yeah, that might suck, but so be it, right? We can agree to disagree and then kind of move on and then come back to it, at some other time. But really promoting that idea of community to kind of rebuild us into something, And it's something where I've spoken to this online, and I've had people basically attack me for the idea, but in a very emotional and intellectually dishonest way. It's like, oh, you want to build a militia, and me and my friends, we don't agree with you, so what's going to happen to us? And I'm like, well, I'm not trying to build a militia. I'm trying to build community. And if you live in that community, then you're a part of it, and I want you to be a part of it. And, if you like apples and I like oranges, fine, I'll let you have more apples. Like, I don't care. Right? It's okay if we don't agree on things. And if I'm okay with not having to agree with you and everything, then it's pretty reasonable that you can be okay with not agreeing with me and everything.
If we have a system of settling disputes, right? A framework. There's plenty of things that can exist. Like, one of the things that we've talked about a little bit on the show is within gun culture having like a path to redemption for some people. Mm-hmm. It sounds a little patronizing, but like, I think there's an issue where within gun culture alone, there seems to be this concern for, I don't know how to say this. We have a lot of judges and not a lot of people worthy of judging. And that's a weird way of saying it. Like, we're a lot of this, like, who are a lot of superficial decision making, and it can happen. Going back a second though, to the issue of the militia argument, is that I guess I have one concern about that one is like, oh, you people will criticize you for trying to create a militia. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not concerned about what that person thinks or if they think at all. Like, this, if you're misconstruing a commitment to my community in the form of not being a useless dead weight as militia building, then so be it. Call it whatever you want. Yeah. Just don't expect to be a part of it. And that's just fine for me. Like, if you want to call training as a militia, you don't have any business in gun culture or America for that matter. You have no like you have no moral standing necessary to be considered an equal amongst people in this country. Yeah. The fact that we're looking at each other and saying, I love you as a friend, you are my neighbor, and in the event that and whatever happens, but I don't want to be a burden upon you when maybe something happens or the disaster could come or it never comes, right? But it's the fact is I'm taking my citizenship seriously, that this is my neighborhood and this is my family and this is my scenario and my whatever it is. Like, it's a hard thing to figure out. Have some basic human humility. But if the mere concept of being, and I will caveat, our criticism against preppers is not that they are trying to be prepared for something, is that their format of preparation tends to be extremely selfish. I'm going to go live, I'm going to isolate myself in the middle of nowhere for 30 years and wait for you to rebuild society. Like, that's okay, dude. When we do, you won't be a part of it because you'll come back and we'll be fine because we did the hard work and you just want to leave and then come back. And that's why we look at like the loner thing with not so much like a tactical deficiency, but like a moral deficiency or a something else. Like, the guy who wants to be a lone wolf and run off into the woods and be like, we don't look at him as if like, well, that's not going to work. I mean, we say things like that, like, okay, you're just going to be a loot box for somebody. But I think the real issue is that, like, you selfish prick. That's what you are.
Yeah, and people, like, when I started this whole thing, people were always like, well, what's your bug out bag? What's your bug out bag? I'm like, I don't have a bug out bag. Like, why would I run away from my home? It's where all of my things are. It's where all my supplies are. And I have, at least initially, running water and electricity. Like, I would not leave that because there's civil unrest, even 2 miles away, there's civil unrest. Like, no, like, this is my fortress. This is my home. I'm going to remain here. And then it's, what can I do now to bolster and protect that? Well, that's building community, and you start with your neighbors, and then you start working down the street, and then you start working through your neighborhood, and that continues to expand, and you network to neighboring neighborhoods. And it's not anything crazy. It's literally as simple as like, hey, and I live in North Carolina, we get hit by hurricanes. It's as simple as saying like, hey, I've got chainsaws. If you don't have chainsaws, a tree comes down your house. You know, if the phones are working, give me a call. If not, ride a bicycle over and I'll come with my chainsaw and I'll cut a tree off your house. I don't actually know you, but like it's that simple. Like that's the idea of community. The training people to, you know, be better with firearms and be better with field craft and small unit tactics is simply a means to an end of that. To build that on a bigger scale, you know, and I'm not the best at it. I suck. I don't generally like, you know, going out and being in public places and hanging out with people, and I'm terrible at reaching out to my neighbors, but at least I know that my neighbors know that if they need something, they can come to me.
Yeah.
None of my neighbors are afraid to come knock on my door. You know, we may not be inviting each other over to barbecues, but when push comes to shove, we know that we can rely, you know, up and down the street. And I have, you know, other people throughout the town and in the local area. And it's just kind of like some of us like me have to kind of get over some of our, you know, social awkwardness in ways to like reach out to people, you know, and kind of extend that network and make that community bigger. But that's all it really is. And there's so many different avenues to get there. And again, they're all going to be different. You know, my wife is also a retired Marine. She's not into all this stuff. She's not into shooting guns. She's not into small unit tactics. It's not her thing. But she is still a good person, and she still does her things to build community and network with people within the spheres of interest that she has. And that's all it is. And you find like-minded people, and then through the crossbreeding of like-minded and not so like-minded people, you start realizing that it's okay that maybe we don't agree on everything. Because even like-minded folks, I don't agree with them on everything, and that's all right. You know, yeah, we're definitely in a weird spot that there's no clear-cut answer to. But for me, the one tool that I have is slowly building community.
I think that's exactly where we're at right now as a culture, and that's a good thing. I don't that in some sense has motivated this production of. We talk a lot about things that are very important to us, and it seems to be hopefully more common. But I want to encourage people like you and I, and then also people who are listening, to say something as simple as go to your friend's house and have an important conversation with him about something that has been on your chest for a while, that involves them. And I guarantee you it'll I can't guarantee, but it will be better than your fears. The like community building does require you to go to your friend and say, "Hey bud, how you doing? Can we I want to do this kind of stuff. Would you want to do it with me? Or what do you think about this?" And setting aside the social anxiety of saying, "Hey, you know, how about let's organize a couple of us together to get to know each other and meet every once in a while, and we get to know each other and just, you know, take care of each other on a basic level. Like, let's build a little bit of a tribe and start to be very deliberate with our closer relationships." Yeah. We can know a lot of people, but be a little bit more deliberate with our closer relationships, especially within gun culture, because it's going to be risky. Mind you, you will find things, you will get burned and it will be painful, but
yeah,
you know, I think that's it. You go to your friend and say, "Hey bud, I like you. Let's kind of build a little bit of you don't even have to, it's not a preparedness community that you can, if that's what you're into, you're already beyond me in this line, but if community building is a deliberate action, it happens both passively and actively. And the passive side is we build community by spending time in community with one another. But the active side is sometimes going, I'm literally sitting here waiting for a gun savior to come in and be like, I have chosen you for a very important objective. I want you to be part of the team. And it's like, how about you just go talk to your neighbor and be like, "Hey dude, you all right?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, Let's go. Let's let's hang out and let's do some stuff together. Let's get to know let's you want to do an area study with me? You want to do a map recon with me? Yeah. You want to get in the car and drive around and start trying to figure out some things about the environment that like we might not know? What's the egress route? What's the ingress route? And I think that's good enough. I think that's not good enough. I think it's a really good place to be. So
yeah.
I think community building is definitely on the forefront of all of our heads right now. And I'm okay. I would rather take on the words of Jordan Peterson and stumble upward rather than sit and wait for the perfect solution.
Yep.
So, well, cool. Let's call it a quits for the day.
Okay.
But if you're interested, we can have another conversation as we keep going deeper into these subjects in the future.
Sure. Cool.
Well, since we're closing, how do people find you? Where do they find your training? Where do they find your social media? Where do you find their drama, or where do they find your drama?
So you can find me on Instagram through Blakewater0326 and also Maneuver Training Solutions _LLC. Share lots of information on there. And then my company is Maneuver Training Solutions. You can Google that. It'll pop up. I do training local to primarily Camp Lejeune, some other venues coming soon, closer to Raleigh and maybe Wilmington. And then, again, I work through Orion Training Group, so follow them on Instagram to stay up to date on classes because that opens up the scope of availability. And I know that's one of the biggest things is location and travel costs. So check them out. There's a good chance that there'll be a class closer to you. And that's how you can also train with me anywhere on the East Coast.
Easy day. Well, that's good to know. We'll stay in touch, Blake. As for those who are still here, thank you for your support through the website. You can find our merch and more at redactedllc.com. If you've been watching this on video, you might recognize the shirt that I'm wearing as something that you may or may not have seen yet. That kind of stuff, the subdued editions will be on the website. So please, if you are interested in supporting us, head over there. Otherwise, thank you for following. Thank you for listening. Let's build this community together and take care. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast.